Alright, so the very first thing that I want and need to make clear before I really get into the meat of this video is that I am definitely on the far left side of the political spectrum. I don't really like the concept of political labels because they mainly serve to obfuscate the discourse, as people prefer to cling to their preconceived notions of what any sequence of syllables really means in their own heads, so they don't have to engage with any actual arguments and bring forth the intellectual labor it requires to critically reflect about their worldview. And this includes what they believe other people think that certain political labels mean. A lot of people hold that kind of shit very, very dear, but you could probably call me a socialist, and you could probably call me an intersectional feminist, and that would be fair enough, I suppose. I also, of course, support the rights of LGBTQ+ people. Like, that should go without saying. Absolute no-brainer. Of course one does that. And I very much think that it's a good thing to be mindful of the experiences of other people and how they have been forced to lead their lives. Be considerate of those things, because empathy, good. That's sort of my controversial statement. But I have to say these things. I really do, because if I don't, and frankly, even now that I have, I am going to be labeled with the worst epithets that the people who are the actual problem here can come up with. But really, I think most people are already seeing what I'm seeing, and they find it exactly as worrying as I do. They just don't want to deal with the drama that's associated with speaking out, and, you know, I get it. Actually, I know for a fact that this is the case because many of the insights of this video have sprung from me having countless conversations with people who are leftists and move in leftist circles who just get mad about the shit that goes on there, but really don't want to pick any fights with people they don't want to pick fights with because they have better things to do with their lives. And I don't mean like the purely theoretical space of intellectual discourse, I mean the actual real day-to-day culture of what it is like being a leftist. So here goes my thesis. Political correctness is a philosophically bankrupt concept that uses a veneer of goodness to create a difficult-to-grasp social power structure which it then uses to control the behavior and identities of people it has no business controlling the behavior and identities of. It creates a set of virtues that can be advertised by harmful actors, and perceived adherence to these virtues not only overwrites any legitimate assessment of the true content of their character, but the very act of questioning their character by people who do not hold the same type of social status that they do within the intangible power structure of politically correct virtue signaling is treated as an unforgivable offense. It is ultimately a type of cultural conservatism, a form of widespread emotional abuse perpetrated by narcissists. And a lot of well-meaning people have been duped into thinking that there are any redeeming qualities about it at all. There's a lot to unpack in those few sentences, and we're going to spend the rest of this video doing exactly that. I suspect, nay fear, that the current generation of young people, sort of Millennials, Zoomers type, that vague general area, is going to be one of the most conservative generations we've seen in modern history. And by this I do not mean modern capital C type conservatism as a political and philosophical ideology, concerned with some sort of fictitious good old days when husbands could still beat their wives and little boys were happy to be sexually assaulted by their teachers. I'm talking about conservatism in a politically relative sense. A calcified enforcement of a strict and often arbitrary code of unwritten social norms, primarily by a difficult-to-define group of people that hold some sort of formal or informal power. You know, the kind of inhumane and deeply repressive social order you'd find in, for example, the Victorian age, except the particular rules are different. An enshrinement of a particular set of sensibilities as sacred, without even a consideration of other viewpoints being possible. Why do I think this? Well, one of the main indicators for conservatism, a practice of caution and restrictiveness, is fear. There is ample evidence for this. Fear is an enormously potent predictor for conservatism. You can check that in the doobly-doo. I have provided some citations. Which makes sense, really, given that trying to control as many things as you possibly can is a classic anxiety and fear response. You feel out of control, you try to be in control so that you no longer feel out of control. Change, new things, things done differently by people who do not share your viewpoint are scary because they are unknown, and the unknown is inherently scary. These are factors of unpredictability. This is why Fox News does so much fear-mongering. They know their audience. It's much more soothing to know that everyone who could possibly impact your life, and that circle usually is considered much wider than it actually is neatly controlled and predictable. This is also a font of stereotyping, even if it's like an evil stereotype about some certain group of people, because stereotyping some group of people as evil is still easier than just not knowing and not understanding what they are about. You just pretend you understand what they're about. It's an evil thing. A lot more chill. The bad is more comforting than the unknown. That is why we as humans have come up with monsters that lurk in the night for thousands of years. Fear is also a very strong survival emotion, meaning that it can override many of the ethical considerations you would usually take with regards as to how you may or may not want to treat your fellow human beings. A lot of mental gymnastics has been done to justify every form of abuse in service of assuaging one's own fear. Point is, the more scared you are, the more conservative you are likely to become. This is also why so many people seemingly become conservatives overnight the second they pop out a kid. Having a child drastically spikes the amount of fear you have in the world. And we are talking about two of the most terrified generations in all of human history, and more of their children are being born every single day. Generations that have suffered through severe, unprecedented crises. 2, if not 3, massive economic crashes within their lifetimes, with the 4th likely on the way. A global pandemic, the likes of which has not been seen in 100 years. The soul-crushing and inescapable indenture to a failing capitalist system. They've had their hopes of leading an even remotely acceptable lives, vaguely comparable of that of their parents, crushed again and again, and are at this point just used to the fact that they are always terrified that the slightest mishap happening to their lives might ruin them as people and financially forever. Like, you stub your toe in an unfortunate way and you are bankrupt. This can happen. This is a reality for tens of millions of people living in the Western world today. The rise of automation and artificial intelligence and the completely unpredictable impact that's going to have on society. Just one of those new sources of existential terror that pop up every single week. And they don't go away just because you're not engaging with them. The war on terror, both with its constant fear-mongering and with its massive erosion of civil rights. The war on drugs, with this opioid epidemic simultaneously driven forward by massive pharmaceutical conglomerates. The literal, actual, for real extinction level threat bearing down on humanity, unprecedented in all of human history, that the people in power, knowing full well that it is going to happen, are doing fuck all to avert. And we have been bombarded with constant reminders that this shit and all the other bad shit that happens in the world anyway, regardless of the things just mentioned, are happening all the time by an array of technologies that is also unprecedented in human history. And for many of us, this has happened since the day we were born. Look, a lot of old people love to pretend that they had it worse, but aside from like a handful of exceptions, they didn't. And if they insist they did anyway, they're either lying to you or to themselves. Or they might just be idiots. That's also completely a possibility, really. The notable exception to this is what we call the silent generation. I mean, you can make a case that they had it not quite as bad as we do also, but that's comparing trauma dicks, and there's no point in doing that. You know, the generation that experienced a thus far unprecedented global war twice, and the Great Depression, and the Holocaust, not to mention a bunch of other shit. Yeah, so the silent generation was famously socially conservative, like extremely so. They are essentially the founders of what we think of as modern conservatism. You know, all those stories of young boomers trying to get the barest minimum of human rights for literally any kind of person who wasn't a white, affluent, Anglo-Saxon Protestant getting shot in the head by police. The silent generation and their cultural conservatism was what they were fighting against. This is a group of people so racist, so sexist, so homophobic, it would make a 14-year-old in an Xbox Live lobby cringe with secondhand embarrassment. That is what surviving the horrors of the early 20th century did to the silent generation. And I think it's very probable that something similar is going to happen with current young people 2 or 3 decades down the line. You know, when the current young people are placed in charge of society and its institutions. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that doesn't happen and it doesn't become the case, but scientifically, the facts are not really on my side for that. Not to mention, I can see the roots of it spreading already, and I have for a while, and if you're entirely honest with yourself, so can you. Thing is, I also think it's rather unlikely that, like, pink-haired, glitter-faced, they-them Zoomers are gonna hit 35 and think to themselves, yeah, I should raise a swastika flag over my house. I think that's a very good idea that is reflective of my personality and political beliefs. And, you know, good. Fascism, especially like militant and extrajudicial fascism, is going to become more and more of a problem in the coming years and decades also, as neoliberal capitalism falters and fails to deliver on its promises of prosperity and freedom. And those in charge decide to cash in their chips with the people more concerned with preserving the social order as opposed to overthrowing it. It's a related issue, but not one that we're going to talk about today. But by and large, and we know this, here's a beautiful graph to illustrate it, of course, link again, doobly-doo, all of that. Zoomers and Millennials, and to a lesser extent, even Gen X, they're not really becoming more conservative as they age. Or I should say right-wing for the terminology of this video. They're not becoming more right-wing. It's happened with pretty much every other generation, but for some reason, the pattern has been broken. Something has happened, and the data shows it's no longer the way it used to be. Sometimes the trend is even reversed, with people getting more progressive as they age, which is certainly something that has happened to me. I could make a whole video unqualifiedly speculating as to what the causes of this might be, but I'm not going to. I mean, I still might if I need the clicks, but it's not happening today. What we do know is that it is the case. It is happening. So any form of conservatism as a calcification of social norms would have to be based on a different set of philosophical axioms. Because the days of go to church on Sunday and hook your gay son up to the car battery are over. And look, I am very fond of, say, perhaps because I am still somewhat rather young myself, I'm very fond of saying, hang on, the kids are actually alright, and they're not going to end all of civilization. That's always been said about every generation of young people, and it has never happened. Except, you know, maybe baby boomers. We still have to see how the whole climate change thing plays out, but it's not like it's their fault alone. But something that's also always been said by those very same young people is that they wouldn't repeat the mistakes of their parents, which has also never happened. I mean, aside from maybe with the exception of baby boomers on account of the whole civil rights thing, but that is really a very particular political issue in a particular time and place. And also, you know, let's be serious, not entirely their accomplishment alone. The same mistakes always show up. They just wear different clothes. I'd love to imagine that we're somehow going to be cycle breakers, but you know, We'd need a lot of therapy as, like, a species for that. Okay, so here is what happens. The conservatism of my generation is, in my opinion, going to be the thing we today call political correctness. Or rather, it already kind of is that. My community is mostly made up of, like, white, cis, straight guys, and you know what, my kings, do not let yourselves be shat on, I appreciate you. But there's also a huge number of people with marginalized identities. I got the minorities, I got the genderqueer, I got the neurodivergent. Specifically, autistic trans women seem to be like a huge, like very disproportionately large chunk of my audience. Hey, hi, how you doing? And something I notice and have heard from them a lot is that they like my community for being a space where people with marginalized identities are accepted, while at the same time not being an absolute fucking cesspool of toxic people constantly shitting on each other to vie for power in a constant struggle to use made-up moral axioms to increase their own standing, which apparently is something that the spaces for people with marginalized identities, the kinds of institutions that exist specifically and expressly for them, overwhelmingly are. Look, I don't reckon, like, it's, there's a certain selection bias going on here, but it's like a lot of them. They're these extremely socially strict little bubbles of people that very openly advertise that they are the space for people with marginalized identities to feel at home and feel supported, while in reality being made up of a complex network of interpersonal grievances and led, ruled, controlled by people who used to get bullied in school and are now enacting their vengeance upon anyone they can get away with by being on an unimaginable power trip. Both in terms of, like, having something to say in a community for once in their lives, finally, and also with the sort of self-righteous indignation that comes with being ontologically the good guy and never having to reflect upon one's own behaviors. They're socially exclusionary in the same way middle school is, because if you ever talk to anyone who's ever sort of done an infraction against me that I didn't like, you're dead to me. And through their loud advertisement of their virtues, they position themselves as a place where people who have also been abused and bullied all of their lives for their marginalized identities will finally, for the first time, find a sense of community in. Only for the experience of that community then being a sort of morally prescriptivist space of enforced positivity and hatred without even the slightest bit of nuance based solely on the personal opinions of the objective, well thought out moral social norms that are actually really the real, true, only way you can behave with other people of whoever has the most social power within that group. To essentially turn out to be bullying and emotional abuse in and of itself that drags you down and chains you by shaming you for not sort of cutting ties with all of the toxic people that exist out there in the world that you might have some sort of acquaintance with that you don't absolutely have to interact with. Like a cult, but you're also constantly exposed to drama as well, which also is something that happens in cults. For all the, like, far-right Christian conservative type cults, we forget that Jonestown was like a far-left super progressive organization. Not to mention those, like, New Age Eastern mysticism cults, most of which were, like, based in some really fucked up forms of racism, but they were still left-wing. And surprisingly, a lot of people find it kind of uncomfortable to be in spaces like that. And many of them, of course, they're not as extreme as cults, obviously, but pretty much all cults started out as organizations much less insane than what they eventually became. Not every idiosyncratic group of worshippers is a cult. The infrastructure to build one is just there, and sometimes it is built. But they are unfortunately rather abundant. I think like pretty much every queer person that I know certainly has at some point in their queer career had contact or, gone through one of these spaces. I hear shit like this all the time, and I'm really not in many of them. A tame but really somewhat common anecdote of this kind of thing happening actually comes from my partner, my girlfriend, who is graciously giving me permission to tell you about this. Basically, she was trying to put a lid on some like social fight, a drama that was happening in some sort of group chat. And then someone accused her of trying to be like deceptive somehow, doing some social finessing, and that was rude because they had autism. And then she said, yeah, look, I have Asperger's myself. It's just we were talking about something different, like we were having an actual conversation, some real discourse, and now it's just pointless social drama. She was then hit up privately because how dare she make such a ghastly statement? Doesn't she know that Asperger was a Nazi? Like the scientist, and he was a homophobe. And given that that's, you know, her actual sort of diagnosis, that's the label she runs around with in the world, she said that while she, of course, didn't know that, she would have appreciated it if she hadn't been verbally tiraded at, with the implication that she herself was a Nazi. Upon which accusations of tone policing were leveled at her in yet another dehumanizing verbal tirade. And look, a lot of people with marginalized identities just rolled their eyes at that story because you know this happens. You've seen it happen, and you're annoyed by it. You're annoyed by it as anyone would be. There is a very good chance it's happened to you or to someone that you know. Again, I hear this kind of shit all the time. There's a billion possible permutations of this kind of thing happening. And in their individual manifestations, they don't seem like a big deal. The problem are the systemic factors with which they happen, and quite frankly, these types of spaces seem to be the natural environment of deeply toxic people. You might get the tiniest fact about some sort of underdocumented culture ever so slightly wrong and be accused of being a horrible white colonialist who never makes even the barest shred of an effort to try to actually understand the culture that they're writing or singing or talking about. Which is of course understandable because of the white brain is too degenerate to understand anything even a centimeter beyond its own horizon. This one is very popular with people who themselves have like this idealized utopian view of whatever culture that is being talked about, which, you know, is actually deeply racist in and of itself because it robs those people from those cultures of their humanity and their moral agency as people able to act out the full spectrum of ethics through internal motivation, as opposed to just some sort of reaction to white people. This is going to blow your mind. Get ready for this. People of color are actually active agents, and not their entire belief system revolves around white people. Or people who have experienced that culture, but who are mad that you're not using their particular interpretation of whatever cultural meme is being talked about at this particular point in time. Like, imagine some sort of Italian dude, and he sends you death threats over the fact that you called it carbonara, even though you dared to purchase a different brand of cured ham than the one that his nonna used to buy. That's not authentic. You're not allowed to call it that. Never mind that the recipe is otherwise completely identical, and like the half of the nonnas that weren't his nonna bought the brand of cured ham that you bought. Cultures are not like a monolithic thing you can put in a textbook to say this is that in that culture. They are loose webs of variable but related ideas, always couched in the individual experience of people immersed in that cultural context. Another classic is, how dare you not respect that person's pronouns that you didn't know about? Preferably in spite of the fact that the person in question is fully aware you didn't know and really just wants to tell you about it so you know for the future, because they're aware you're not a mind reader and they are fully aware that perhaps, much like you forget people's names, you might forget their pronouns in the future. And that's unfortunate, but it happens. It's about making the effort so they can feel respected as human beings. The person chewing you out is not that person, though, although, of course, there might be, in which case it is just as unreasonable because you literally cannot know the names of people either before they tell you. But often it's not the same person, it's just someone who's decided that the person in question isn't outraged enough. And really, quite frankly, how dare you make that joke with your private group of friends in a private conversation that you were having and that you all thought was hilarious. I was actually eavesdropping on your private conversation and I didn't think it was very funny. Really, the decent thing to do would be for every human being on the planet to adjust every interaction they have with every other human being on the planet to my personal sensibilities. Because that friend of yours over there, they were actually offended by that joke because it was made at their expense. And no, I don't actually care to hear their opinion on whether or not they found that joke acceptable. They have internalized whateverism and I actually do not. So I just know better than them how they feel, okay? This often also goes hand in hand with just unfathomably horrid vitriol being leveled at people of, you know, identities that are not usually marginalized, like white people. But every kind of marginalized identity will find itself treated this way at some point or another. It's just depending on who you are and who's talking to you, like what manner they are being controlling in. It's gonna be delivered in like a more nice, positive, verbal shell. But you can't sugarcoat the fact that you're telling a grown-ass adult how to behave. But especially with people who have non-marginalized identities, there is this expectation that sometimes you can just sit them down and hurl the most vile abuse at them and they just have to sit there and take it because by the very nature of their birth, they are evil and need to be punished for it. I have seen shit that would legally be considered assault justified through this, and like defending yourself against it or defending other people against it would not be politically correct. Systemic facts are used to discriminate on an interpersonal level, and that's just not how that works. Some people who have a reasonable definition of the word might even call that shit racism. My personal favorite though, because this is the one that's happened to me personally the most, I am offended that you made a joke about your own culture or condition, and I am forbidding you from doing this. I am punishing you for it, and I will rob you of your agency to do that because you are neurodivergent and you just don't understand the challenges of the world. You cannot call yourself high functioning because I don't like that word, and for my worldview to make sense, you need to be a victim, no matter how much that is a reality in your life. If you move in these kinds of spaces, you can probably summon a whole bunch of scenarios as to shit like this happening. And the perpetrators, I think, are two very different kinds of people. Most of them, I reckon, are individuals who have seen other people be shat upon very often and who like think that it's just the right thing to do, or have themselves been corrected in their entirely valid forms of expression, but forgiven because they were new. They've sort of become rather uptight about certain things and think that it's actually okay to impose that on other people. Not only that, but that it is like the morally correct thing to do, and if you don't do it, actually, you're a bad person. They get genuinely offended about shit because they think the person saying whatever shit is being said is actually doing something heinous, even if objectively they're not. They're well-intentioned, they think they're making the world a better place by being like this, but they're still kind of morally busybodying in a way that's not just extremely overreaching, but also rather obnoxious. I don't actually think you have a right to tell other adult people how they are allowed to talk. That's a violation of their boundaries. You can certainly express your wishes or like communicate with them like on an eye-to-eye level, although crucially that does not mean that you can just use nice words to be a moral busybody. They are your peers. You are in no position to make prescriptions to them. Which of course leads me to the group of people who love to do this, and they are the people who are actually the root of the problem. The kind of people who see their own marginalized identity, or somehow worse, the marginalized identities of others, as a means of exerting social control and power over other people. Because they're not interested in being your peer. They want to be your superior. They may pretend otherwise, but their actions will speak for themselves. They want to be able to tell you what to do, and victimhood in a just society is actually a very effective tool of doing so. The very idea that they have to like sort of communicate and compromise and coexist in the same space as other people, because those other people are actually fully valid human beings who have the same right to exist as they do, is repulsive to them. In other words, narcissists. And look, if a narcissist has to play the victim to have power over others, they will do it. It's a tactic that works especially well with decent people. Which, for the record, I think that most people are decent. They're not moral paragons, but they are decent. Because it allows you to make the other person feel guilty, so they feel like they owe you now, and you can exploit that to treat them like absolute shit. The fact that they've decided you've hurt them now gives them a lot of leeway in retaliating against you. And if you defend yourself against their righteous anger, against whatever it is they have decided to punish you with, that's because you don't see them as a human being, of course. That is how they feel. Which, just to decode that, the core thought process here is, if I have to respect you as a human being, that means you do not respect me as a human being. You see the problem with that. And sure, some people, especially victims of abuse, sometimes go through like a phase of narcissistic behavior to establish new boundaries that they never had and an identity for themselves that was entirely eroded by other narcissists in their past. Most of them eventually grow out of that, and that's great, but also they're not entitled to forgiveness for the actions that they have taken against others. Some of them also just have savior complexes, which is a whole different type of psychological issue that they need to resolve internally. There's an excellent video by a clinical psychologist. I'm gonna link it. Generally, the channel Theremin Trees is tremendous. You should definitely go subscribe to it. Look, I was emotionally abused for most of my childhood, and I've been to a lot of therapy for it. I see when shit like this is happening. And right now, the place where I see it the most is progressive spaces. Which is not to say that it can't be found elsewhere. You know the trope of sort of queer people having to live their entire lives in the closet because them coming out would break their father's heart? It's not a malicious thing of, oh, I'm gonna cut off your hands if you come out. It's like the guilt trip is used to control them. Replace father with any other family member that is either an abusive narcissist or a smokescreen for an abusive narcissist to justify their controlling behavior. That's sort of an appeal to mental health too, like the idea that you being who you are actually actively in the world would ruin their mental health because it doesn't line up with their perception of who you should be. Part of our cultural ethos has become to make mental health sort of almost unassailable as a concept, just in an effort so that people will like pay the barest amount of mind to people who are traumatized or neurodivergent, which is a good thing. Mental health should be taken seriously. But there is a difference between expecting people to be mindful of your condition and expecting the entire world to shrink to your size. Exploiting this idea is very popular with people who are social manipulators these days, but it's always been the case. That's a story a lot of queer people, especially in the past, have experienced. It's very common. Just like how it used to be politically incorrect to show an interracial kiss on television, or mention the very existence of gay or transgender people. Or when nowadays fucking snowflakes on Twitter complain that there's a woman in their video game. That is also political correctness. It's just that the politics are different. And let's be serious, political correctness as a concept did not emerge on the left. It is inherently a right-wing concept. Back in the day, the Nazis gave out news reporting licenses only to Aryans with politically correct opinions. Might even call the kinds of leftists who do this type of shit reactionary. Because it turns out the right wing does not have a monopoly on that either. It is a rigid model of thought that is much less about, like, actually critically reflecting upon your own beliefs, behaviors, and the problems that exist in society, but about having a objectively correct opinion that other people share. In other words, it's purely a catalyst for social drama games. The ethical and intellectual components are just a costume. Because many, not necessarily even leftists, might be rather surprised to hear is that, like, almost none of this shit can be found in the academic literature that people like to proclaim it comes from. It springs not from the minds of intellectuals, but from the whims of emotionally dysregulated teenagers on social media. Of course, texts exist that say everyone who hurts your fifis should be lined up against the wall and shot, because it's very easy to put that stuff in academia. Academia exists precisely to consider that type of bullshit. The person who wrote that might not even believe it, but it is essential that it be able to enter the academic discourse nonetheless. Now, there are actually like intellectuals, academics, that kind of people who are very much indoctrinated into this dogmatic worldview that has very little in common with what is actually happening in the real world. The ivory tower of academia does offer a certain degree of disconnect. This happens everywhere on the political spectrum, by the way, intelligent people being insane. You know, like Ben Carson, the Republican who wanted to become president a couple years ago? Brilliant neurosurgeon, apparently. Revolutionized the field. He's also a hyper-conservative Christian and like an honest-to-God creationist. Some academics are also just terrible people seeking intellectual reasons to justify their abuse. A lot of very intelligent people are, in fact, unimaginable assholes. But critical theory and its derivatives, which often take the blame for this kind of shit happening, they don't bear the blame for any of that. In fact, the very concept of political correctness doesn't work with critical theory. They're mutually incompatible. If you want to drastically oversimplify it, critical theory is a mental toolkit that you use to question everything. That's why it's called critical theory. It's critical. It can be critical of anything, like anything. In fact, it was originally developed as a tool of combating the ideas of political correctness embedded in the grand narratives of the silent generation and the generations that came before. Now, a lot of you, especially on the left, might say, yes, sure, all of that sounds horrible. But it is just a tiny minority of people doing this kind of shit. Most leftists are sort of a little bit dirtbaggy, which is true. It's completely true. It's a very correct, accurate statement. Yeah, this might come as a surprise, especially to like the few right-wingers who are still watching, but most leftists are actually, they don't give a shit about these kinds of woke scold people. They don't particularly like them either. They just don't have the energy to engage with their bullshit all the time, so they eventually just go and do their own thing. It really is just a very loud minority. However, that doesn't matter at all. It's completely irrelevant. You know, I do see this excuse brought up a lot, like, oh, the fucking weird behavior of a few narcissists shouldn't be taken as indicative of all of leftism, especially by people who aren't leftists, which it's such a weak excuse. Entirely impractical. Naive and idealistic in a way that leftists really shouldn't be. And transparently so as well, because clearly most of the people who are not on the left think of the far left specifically as pink-haired, obnoxious culture warriors. And blaming people for being deceived by the deceptive, gigantic elephant in the room is kind of dumb. Most people have not spent their time learning the exact same things as you and moving in the exact same circles as you. You don't know most of the important things in the world, and they don't either, because nobody does. Don't shit on people for not having a piece of information they have never encountered in their entire lives. The type of people who fit into the pink-haired culture warrior archetype want to be the only thing that is actually considered truly leftist. And right-wing and even centrist media loves parading them around as opposed to the people who actually want to practice dialogue because they are off-putting as shit. And given that almost no one on the left actually dares to challenge these people, we shouldn't be surprised that they take up as much of the stage as they do. In fact, anytime somebody does try to challenge them, well, look in the comments of this video, you're gonna find quite a few. Do you know why your local town, your local neighborhood is shit? You know why they didn't build the wind farm or the co-generator unit, the community garden, or make the streets pedestrian accessible? Most people in the neighborhood, if you ask them about these things, they would say, Yeah, that sounds cool. I'm fine with that. And the rest really don't give a shit. When it's there, it's gonna be there, and they will enjoy it as far as any of those things can be enjoyed. Probably 80 to 90% of people are always in favor of really effective neighborhood, town, or city improvement projects. But you don't have a wind farm, you still have to heat with gas, and children are not playing in the streets because they're full of cars because of one particular thing. NIMBYs. Which, in case you don't know, it stands for not in my backyard. Though in this video, we're going to use it as a stand-in for all kinds of self-interested busybodies of all kinds of ideologies. Despite making up only a small fraction of the population, NIMBYs have a hugely outsized political impact in every level of decision making. This is because anytime something is being planned that would mildly inconvenience them, potentially in their minds, they can imagine, they're going to go to the decision makers to air their grievances about it. And to be clear, these are the kinds of people who would oppose a playground being built in the park because they imagine it would be allowed the one time a year they actually make use of that park to take a walk when they walk past that particular spot. And they really don't want that. They are also very strongly drawn to positions of petty authority, like your local council, your homeowners association, or your neighborhood watch. Because they delight in the power that they feel when they get to set rules for other people. And what do you expect from the kind of individuals who will lobby to have your dog put down because it dared to bark after 7 p.m.? The chill people are not going to be the ones who end up setting the rules because setting rules is not something that chill people do. Anarchists are not known for striving to have power over other people. People who wouldn't mind a thing are not going to go to bat over that issue. They have full lives of their own with plenty of concerns and very little time. So not only do decision makers already receive a very biased picture of how their constituents actually feel, the boards are also stacked with petty tyrants. And while this is certainly true in institutions with formalized authority, it is also true in much more ephemeral social spaces of culture and community. It is infinitely draining to pick fights with these people over the little petty bullshit things that they get mad about, because they draw energy from that and they can keep on going indefinitely about it. Think about this, right? How many people are actually bothered by swearing, and whose sensibilities are the broadcasting guidelines written to accommodate? Almost every single person on the planet swears. It's a normal human thing to do. It is in fact weird when you are the kind of person who doesn't swear. That is an odd thing to be. Not to mention that objectively there is zero harm in using swear words. And yet, throughout most of the English-speaking world, broadcasting guidelines written by institutions and sometimes even by law ban swearing, or otherwise regulated in an absurd and unreasonable fashion. Even on this very platform, the fact that I swear because I'm an adult talking to adults, which by the way I need to specify with every single video, when you upload a video to YouTube, you need to click the box that says, no, this is not made for kids. So this whole notion of, oh, it's to protect the children is just obviously and transparently bullshit. Stop using your kids as a shield for your narcissism. YouTube says it's because of the advertisers say it's because of the guidelines, and the guidelines say it's because of this group of people that is so small that most of us don't know a single person in it. A very large number of people and institutions enforces the particular sensibilities of a tiny, tiny group of Puritans that may not even exist anymore today. So this kind of thing happens. It is visible even in today's liberal society. And even among groups with no formalized hierarchy, leadership figures, trusted individuals, folks who are considered neutral arbitrators, often still emerge in an informal context. They have no formal authority and they can always be challenged, but no one can deny that even in groups without hierarchy, there are some people who just factually have more of a say than others. Not because they deserve it, but because of random factors that they really have no control over themselves. I know this because I am one of these people. Most of the communities that I've actually, cared to dedicate a good amount of my time to because I care about what they do, I have sort of naturally risen to a position of authority and respect and often like the top of whatever flat hierarchy that they have. I didn't ask for that shit. I never asked for this. It just happens to me. I don't want to have power over other people. They put me there. Sometimes they wear me down and I do whatever it is that I'm supposed to do. I accept the responsibility that they have entrusted me with, which of course I appreciate the respect that is in there. Usually I do that to avoid some petty despot getting into that same position. And I figure the only reason this is because I talk good. I know how to speak well. And that makes me seem a lot smarter than I actually am. But if I, for instance, was a power-hungry narcissist, which I still might be, you don't know that, this could all be a fucking act, even an informal position of social authority would be a great starting point to build a power base from. The church was primarily a social institution in the way it worked for the lives of most people. They had the authority to say what was and what wasn't politically correct to the extent that the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire was legitimized through them. And we all know that the church, way back when, had a lot more power than just being able to control what people were allowed to think, do, and say. Even though those were the only domains they really claimed for themselves. And they managed to do this because, in the zeitgeist of the day, they managed to establish for themselves interpretational sovereignty over what was good and what was bad. Their authority was beyond challenge, sacred, inherently because of who they were. Representatives of the ultimate, accurate, correct, and objective moral truth. God. Incidentally, also the only person who knows just how much they abused that power. This is part of the reason why I like to refer to, political correctness, petty despots as sort of theologians and clerics. Because they seek to establish the same kind of sanctity, only instead of the basis of God, it's on the basis of the unassailability of their own victimhood. So instead of me deciding that whatever it is you're saying is against Daddy and his authority, you are certainly not allowed to question, it's that you're hurting me with it, objectively, and there's nothing you can say against it that makes you a heretic. Any insistence to the contrary just makes you more of a heretic. Because who would seek to defend themselves against such an accusation if not a heretic? For a somewhat more informal example, we only need to go to the previously brought up Victorian England, which had its own Byzantine code of strict social norms established by upper-class social clubs. All the while being a horrible time of unbelievably abusive power dynamics and unfathomable amounts of hypocrisy. This kind of conservatism, political correctness, is like an insect hotel for structures of abuse. Even if you do not want to enforce the particular social edicts and rules given by the powerful, not going along with it will result in the invariable destruction of your life. Shunnings to the point where even interacting with people that are considered heretics is in and of itself an act of heresy worse than the original heresy itself have always been part of this kind of thing. Because to not participate in the shunnings of those who question the narratives presented is a greater danger. Doesn't matter the content of the actual heresy, the ability to even think about it in any rational or critical way, even if it is to reject the heresy, is dangerous to the power structure. Which is why I personally am always incredibly wary of anyone who insinuates that person X, Y, and Z is some form of problematic. So it should be clear that all three of these example societies, and pretty much all of the example societies you can come up with, will use guilt and shame as a mechanism to make people toe the line. And I want to just mention this, make it abundantly clear so there is no ambiguity about it. Guilt tripping is emotional abuse. But of course, inducing guilt and extracting apologies from people is what makes these petty narcissists feel powerful. And look, they're masters of hiding their narcissism in legitimate grievances. They seek to build an association with doing the right thing feeling good and doing the wrong thing feeling bad, which is not how ethics works. Sometimes doing the right thing is difficult, and sometimes doing the wrong thing feels really good. There's a degree of metacognition and empathy you need to understand these things. But that is really the root of probably most emotional abuse that happens, to make the people who are doing the emotional abuse feel good. Or gooder, at least. If you're a person with some sort of marginalized identity, you know your local marginalized identity club, and you probably also know the kind of people who run it. If there is just one poisonous individual, they will make every move of politicking available to get to that position of petty authority where they get to make the rules. Now, this kind of thing does happen pretty much everywhere in society, but people with marginalized identities are uniquely vulnerable to this kind of emotional abuse. Not always, but very often. Nowadays, we sort of live in a spot where such institutions can be somewhat insular while still having the ear of certain authorities. So bad actors are drawn to them specifically, much like the same bad actors are drawn to vulnerable people, which are often people with marginalized identities. Part of the reason why so many priests are pedos is because they see the position of power and authority that it would give them, and they are drawn to that. They know they will be untouchable. And even though most priests are probably perfectly kind people, we still know, because of that significant minority, what kind of an institution of systemic abuse the church is. If you create a position of unchecked social power, people interested in acquiring that unchecked social power will flock to that position. It is essential to be able to question power, even if that power is disguised as a lack of power. And of course, we're not talking about something quite as heinous as pedophilia here. Although pedophiles have attempted to maliciously insert themselves into LGBTQ+ spaces, not too much success, in order to use these marginalized identities as shields for their own abuse. We're talking about the conversation. And because all the cool people are cool, narcissists often find themselves in a position where they get to set the tone of the conversation. And a lot of people don't even realize that they're just making up ideological precepts to contort reality to whatever fits them in that given moment. They will come up with all kinds of bullshit to create unquestionable justifications to control the people that they want to control. They're extremely good at this. And it trickles down through society, culture, and the institution. When the internet is mad about something, 90% of the time, it's some tiny group of people, sometimes even a single lone individual, using tech savviness and just being very loud and dedicated to raise a huge sting. Because that's all it takes to have enormous sway over massive multi-billion-dollar institutions that will do anything to conform with their idea of good optics. Which, again, isn't even good optics. It's most people don't care about that shit, or they are annoyed by it. They're just not terminally online enough to do anything about it. And if it's that easy with powerful institutions, how easy do you think it is with, like, regular people? Especially people who have marginalized identities and often already feel weak and isolated. They are preying on vulnerable young people looking for a space where they can finally belong. And that is also where we get into the why this is actually all as massive a deal as I am making it out to be. Because some of you might still be thinking, yeah, sure, I mean, yes, definitely, this is all bad, and even if it's just a small group of people, but do you really have to, like, doom-monger burger about this being this huge societal collapse type thing? It's not the fucking Gestapo. And frankly, is it really all that bad if this particular set of beliefs becomes political correctness, as opposed to some worse right-wing set of beliefs? I mean, it's good to be mindful of marginalized communities, right? Yeah, I think it is. I think it is good to be mindful of that. I think everyone in society should be more mindful, and I do mean everyone, of other experiences that other people may have made because of their identities. It is always virtuous to be mindful of the problems and unique challenges that the people around you face, and also the people that you don't know and that aren't around you. However, the benefactors of the type of sacred authority of belief that comes with political correctness are not really people with marginalized identities. Maybe some individuals who have marginalized identities, but certainly not them as a group. The benefactors are those who prove themselves to be charismatic manipulators and institutional ladder climbers. This idea that it's like all white women claiming to be speaking for minority groups, which, for the record, not even people who are from minority groups can speak for their entire minority group. They're still individuals with their own life experiences and opinions, and them having certain life experiences and opinions doesn't rule out other people who have the same identity also having different opinions and life experiences. It's a stereotype, but there is a shred of truth in it. Like the whole girl boss feminism shit that a lot of feminists are very, very tired of, right? This idea that having a bunch of female CEOs and like female heads of state, it doesn't do jack shit for the overwhelming majority of women. It's just a narrative that power-hungry people push because they know it's going to give them an edge. They clothe themselves in virtue for their own personal gain. And if you are a person with some sort of marginalized identity who has ever gone up against one such petty despot, you know how little your identity actually matters. Because what is right in that particular situation is ultimately always determined by social influence and rhetoric. And they will find some sort of rhetoric to discredit you. You might not even notice it at first. They're not in those positions because they are bad at manipulating people. It is a core tenet of the whole woke scold culture that when you are being woke scolded, you need to listen and learn. You need to uncritically accept what is being told you, or otherwise you are an agent of evil. And look, of course, you should always strive to expand your horizons and take the opinions of other people seriously. But you should also learn to trust your own judgment, because their opinions are also just opinions, and they're not perfect either. I am listening and I am learning is a position of unquestioning acceptance of someone else's authority, an erasure of one's individual agency that abuses, and only abuses, want people to be in. Not individuals who actually want you to agree with them because you agree with what they are saying, and certainly not people who respect you as a human being. And philosophically speaking, especially in regards to critical theory and how it works, it doesn't even really matter whether they are right or wrong. It is the calcification of discourse itself that is harmful to the very act of thinking. To utilize critical theory, you need to be able to think and freely question everything. And you need to be able to do it not just within the confines of your own head, but also in public discourse. And frankly, the moment the right thing to believe is not 100% synonymous with the factually correct thing to believe, I don't think it really should be taken very seriously. And also, you should never believe that you are definitely completely correct about anything that you're saying. Like, that should never happen. You can only be the best you can be to the best of your current ability. It's also a problem that this kind of tone policing, and this is actually tone policing, is entirely ineffective at generating any of the change that it actually proclaims to be able to generate. An abstract example of this that I love is the whole, like, using the gentler term thing that happens when referring to a marginalized group of people. It is, of course, the case that certain words have always existed solely as insults, and when that happens, a new word tends to arise to describe that same identity, to refer to a group of people. And then as the old term becomes more and more unacceptable to say, the new term eventually becomes the insult and adopts the same meaning that the old term used to have. And then a new word is made up to replace the original replacement. And then eventually that becomes the insult. Look, language is not a magic spell. This isn't Harry Potter. The insulting connotation of a word emerges when that word is used with the intent to insult. The word itself is just a sound. It is the intent that is heinous, and by getting rid of the sound, you are not getting rid of the intent behind it. The intent is just going to find a different sound to inhabit, and will do so until you run out of sounds. Not to mention, this word sanitization treadmill sanitizes a lot of concepts that really should not be sanitary because they're not. But that's a different video for another day. And yet a shit ton of activist labor is wasted on that treadmill. This means that a lot of actually important structural and systemic work is not getting done. But language being made up of magic spells is important to these petty despots because it allows them to construct the reality that they please. So political correctness doesn't just waste leftist activist resources at an alarming rate. It also hinders leftist coalition building. And coalition building is something that you absolutely have to do if you want to enact change against those in power. But for that, you need to cash in on the things you have in common and respect the things that you don't. Leftist political correctness in its current incarnation is the exact opposite of doing that. It claims to help being mindful of each other's differences, but in practice, the only thing it really does is create drama. If you are a leftist capable of even a hint of critical thought, you cannot deny that this is true. You know it happens. No matter what it is that you say and do, someone will show up and find a way to interpret it as an act of evil and try to sabotage your activism efforts. It always happens. As we've established, it doesn't matter that it's a small group of people. Or you can't use that hashtag, or you're not actually being inclusive to that particular group that I made up just now. And quite frankly, I don't care that you've dedicated your entire existence to fighting systemic racism. That haircut is racist. So you now must stop all of your activism efforts, apologize to me because that'll make me feel powerful, and then I will still go ahead and try to destroy your life and the lives of everyone you've ever associated with, because it makes me feel good. Remember Occupy Wall Street? I know this is revealing me to be this huge boomer, but I remember it quite well. It was a great movement. It was creating a lot of buzz. It was building up to be an effective coalition of just regular people who had socialist issues about wealth inequality and political corruption. But eventually, the politically correct woke skulls of their day showed up. They sucked up all the media attention because they love that attention because it gives them power, and started their work of fracturing Occupy Wall Street by sowing drama. A lot of people back then suspected that it was Wall Street itself that brought these woke skulls in, and there is a bit of a coincidence with the sudden skyrocketing in media coverage when that started to happen. I don't think that's what happened personally, but I also think it's an entirely reasonable belief to have. Much like many people today believe that, like, a significant portion, if not most, of these folks are feds and glowies. The reason I don't think that happened is because I don't think that Wall Street needed to lift a single finger to make it happen. This is an Occam's razor type situation for me. They knew that eventually these petty narcissists wearing the aesthetics of revolution would make an appearance and then exploit people's good nature to guilt trip them into giving them control over every aspect of the event. Every one of these small societies that is ruled by its own little cabal of petty despots has its own idiosyncratic particular rules and interpretations of the ideology. Because, people are different. They're not all the same. There's no objective book of political correctness. And most of these people really do not want to be in competition with each other, much less with people who are actually there to do the work instead of just giving attention to the loudest person in the room all the time. To them, creating drama is what feels like activism because it makes them feel good. And so any organizations actually trying to get work done are rendered ineffective by either having to apologize all day or having to fight each other all the time. A huge number of moderate leftists are massively put off by this kind of shit. Because what kind of effect do you think this kind of shit has on just regular working people, average individuals who just want to do a little bit, they have a little bit of time and energy, and they want to use that to make the world a better place? What do you think goes through these people's heads when they come back home from a protest against wealth inequality and see themselves on the internet as being someone who attended a protest that was transphobic because one of the flags on the stage wasn't the precise kind of LGBT flag that this particular person writing that article would have preferred to see? How do you think people like that feel when they go to a protest against police brutality, and when they come home, they see that their Instagram story has been commented on as, "Why the fuck are you intruding on black spaces? This is a black issue. Get the fuck out of that protest." If we, as leftists, ever want to get anything done, we need to stop giving these narcissists the time of day. Because the people saying this are not trans people, they're not black people. They may be a trans person or a black person, and let's be serious, often not even that. They do not speak for everyone. But because they're narcissists, they feel entitled to go out there and claim that they can. I suspect this is also why so many of them seem to have such an easy time infantilizing minorities and sort of robbing them of their agency and individuality, because ultimately they just see them as tools for their own advancement. It turns out there is rather a gulf between expanding someone's perception to include the degree of their own oppression and prescribing them a worldview because deep down you do not actually see them as fully human beings. You can't imagine the amount of people in marginalized groups as well, plenty of minorities, who just completely disconnect from politics because they cannot stand the constant drama that these people are summoning all the time. Because drama is exhausting, and because they see and understand that they, as individuals, minorities or not, don't actually want to be treated like children. How do you think people like Sargon of Akkad managed to drag in so many just moderates? People who, on an issue-by-issue basis, actually hold mostly left-wing positions. He doesn't immediately bust open a can of white genocide. Especially during his more moderate days, most of his content was critical analysis from a class-based viewpoint of actual leftist culture. It was a pro-freedom lens, a coalition-building lens. Much like the media at large, he takes out the examples of people on the left being toxic individuals to demonstrate to moderates that the left is actually a terrible political home to have, where the only thing that'll happen is that people will backstab you. People like him will show you individuals loudly advertising their virtues while also showing you how utterly vile they are underneath. It doesn't matter that these examples are cherry-picked because it is what outsiders see. We as leftists cannot wash our hands of this. Because anytime outsiders come to interact with the left, those are the exact people who will come out of the woodwork to shit on them and everything they have to say. You won't believe the degree of vitriol that has been hurled at me personally, simply because I am a mostly straight cis white male who dares to believe in leftist political issues simply because they are captured by the fervor of their own self-righteousness. I don't blame anyone for not wanting to expose themselves to that, because I don't think it is actually too much to ask to be respected as a human being. Call me an entitled white man, but I really feel that just the tiniest shred of basic decency is not an unreasonable thing to want. And plenty of leftists will reflexively go out of their way to defend these people simply because they have the right flags in their bio, and either deny their existence or see an opportunity to feel a little self-righteous about their activism themselves and join in on the guilt-tripping and vitriol. Many also because they live in terror of saying the wrong thing, and that includes not saying a thing. And look, not every work scold is a narcissist. Many of them are actually victims of these types of narcissists. It can be incredibly difficult to identify the actual narcissists among them, and quite frankly, I personally think it's a bit of a waste of time to try. But what do you think that does to the personality development of already terrified young people if they exist in an environment where these petty despots, because institutions that are that kind of thing usually exist on universities, places of intellectual discourse, where then even thinking the wrong thing might get you shunned socially, like you have leprosy in 18th century Wild West America. Leftists need to realize that culture warriors are pure poison to everything we're trying to achieve. And though I must say, personally, at this precise moment in time, I am hopeful because I see a lot of people waking up to that kind of shit. Partly because also the right is picking up the mantle of political correctness again with just crying rivers over literally every single piece of media that comes out. I still fear for the future, just because of the, scientific facts that we have with the fear leading to conservatism and the young generations not becoming more right-wing as they age. There is no need, I think, to dismantle these kinds of institutions that advocate for minority groups. I think it's way better to have them than not to have them in any case. Instead, we all need to gain an awareness and start supporting the actual good-natured, kind-hearted people that are trying to do good within these institutions and for all these marginalized groups, no matter their identity, really. You know, people who can actually be trusted with positions of power, who, in my experience, tend not to be the ones that raise their hand when a position of power is on the table. Because unfortunately, those kinds of good-hearted people are exactly the kind of folks upon which abusers prey, and whom they definitely have to defend themselves against. And I think for that to happen, we need to grow wise to the tactics of these narcissistic control freaks, which starts by actually seeing them as such. And once we do that, a lot of the weird shit that they do makes a lot more sense. Like, why are they so insistent upon the idea that the social context of when and how something was said doesn't matter at all? Because they refuse to accept that there is in fact a difference between saying a sentence on an edgy comedy podcast and saying that same sentence in an actual political discussion with people who can make decisions. Well, it's simply because they do not want to allow for the potential existence of a context where they cannot control the behavior of other people. They're trying to sort of completely waterproof their system, plug up any leaks. Additionally, people with marginalized identities, or really with any identities, being able to make fun of each other's identities is something that people who are close with each other and trust each other do. Bonding happens because what it means in a social context is I trust you to have good beliefs about me, who I am, and my identities, in spite of the particular sequence of words that is coming out of your mouth right at this moment. It's a form of emotional intimacy, and narcissists cannot bear emotional intimacy. Their egos are way too fragile for them to trust anyone. And they hate to see it among other people because that means those people trust each other more than they trust the narcissist, and they can't have that either. A trust which, quite frankly, is not really worthy of the name because in their heads, people trusting them means people accepting their unquestioned authority. Why do they insist on forcing other people to participate in shunnings and emotional exclusion as a culture of, oh, this is just the consequences of your actions, instead of the actual emotional blackmail that it really is? Right, so the main people that they will attract, that any cult attracts, this is how cults operate, are people who are looking for a sense of community. This is ironically also why many people who leave a cult end up in a different cult again some of the time. It's a very insidious process, and they need to be able to hold that threat of withdrawing this community, which is the thing that they seek. They don't go there because they want to experience abuse. They need to be able to take that away from them. This is also why they consider associating with outsiders who they think of as enemies as basically making you an enemy yourself. It makes you complicit in some sort of act of sanitizing the anathema. Even though, once again, that is essential to the act of coalition building. Not only are the leaders of this group, the petty despots, worried that it might introduce novel ideas into the internal discourse of the group, which might threaten their power base. It's also much more difficult to punish people with social exclusion when they have a solid social environment outside of the one that was constructed for them by the petty despot. This is why, structurally, loneliness and isolation often leads to radicalization. Why do so many of them insist that actually subjective anecdotal life experience trumps every form of objective data collection, even though quantitative analysis of any given issue usually leads us to left-wing conclusions? Well, because they don't really give a shit about leftism, they just want the absolute authority to be able to control the social context that they surround themselves with. And it's much easier to do that with anecdotes because you can just make those up as the situation requires. Why is it so important to these people to have a form of racial prejudice that you're not allowed to call racism, which is somehow less bad? Not even the merits of the thing, but why is it so important to these people that that be a thing? Because they'll insist, oh no, it's the same level of bad, but also the delineation still definitely needs to exist. And also kind of one of them is more justified than the other. But it definitely isn't more justified, but it kind of is more justified, and we really need this delineation. It's because they need to create an ontological enemy to feel righteous about all of their actions against that ontological enemy. And to be able to give that feeling to others, the people who are in their favor, because self-righteousness can be rather addictive, especially to people who feel they have been wronged somehow and need to project that sense of having been wronged on some external force. Not to mention that if you're manipulating a group of people, it's also always convenient to have an outside group of people that you can blame everything on. You can always make the people then be mad at that thing instead of you when things don't go the way you'd planned. Why do they demand that media, books, films, video games, whatever, always pass direct and unambiguous moral judgment, include the messaging within, to every aspect of what is portrayed as to whether it is good or bad? Things cannot be portrayed just as the things that they are, because that is neutrality, and neutrality as such is tacit approval. People cannot see someone beating the shit out of a little kid and then come to their own conclusion that yeah, actually, that person may be bad. This reflects a fundamental distrust in other people's ability to come to their own conclusions, because there is a non-zero chance that that conclusion will be different than the conclusion that the narcissist needs you to come to. Because again, these people do not think of you as their peer. They do not think of you as their equal, no matter how much they insist otherwise. Why do they insist that allyship must mean submission? Why do you have to kneel? Why do you have to shut up? Why are you not permitted an opinion of your own based on your identity? Same fucking reason, except of course for these narcissists, they also really like the opportunity to have the ability to actually treat some group of other people as their inferiors openly, and to be celebrated for it. Because here's the true thing about all this: allyship does not mean submission. It is mutually incompatible with that. To be someone's ally, you must be their peer. Maybe not in terms of the actual power that you have as a person, but definitely within the context of the coalition. Otherwise, you are by definition no longer an ally, but either a servant or a patron. Look, ultimately what it boils down to is that pretty much all tone policing is an incredibly boundary-violating, infantilizing act to impose upon other people. Infantilization, by the way, is emotional abuse also, just like all the other things listed. And like so often with narcissists, it is always paired with some sort of mechanism that puts you beyond reproach. Doesn't really matter what that mechanism is, it just needs to work. So it's always existed, in every culture. It's not unique to leftism, but it is here right now. And I believe that it is antithetical to leftism. If you subscribe to the idea that leftism is about democracy, equality, and the abolition of hierarchy. And if you don't believe in these values, you're a cunt. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities. You know, should I say do not spam them? I of course don't want you to spam them, but that's really their moderation issue. I've been saying this for years. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And look, fucking, I really need to get back to making. I know this kind of shit used to be my bread and butter, but the older I get, the more tired I am of politics and the drama and the inhumanity of it. It fucks me up, and this video was pretty difficult to make, so appreciate me and see you around, cunts. But you know, in the affectionate way, the way that